The security badge in my hand says I don't exist. My own company erased me. No access, no identity, just a ghost in the system. Marcus Sterling signed my death certificate and pocketed $15 million. But I'm still breathing. The flash drive in my pocket holds the proof. And if I don't get out of this server room in the next 30 seconds, I'll be as dead as they want me to be. The door locks just clicked. They're coming. I'm not supposed to be here. The rain outside is freezing. The air smells like burning wires. And the only way out is past the man who just tried to kill me. One wrong move, and Arthur Vance stays dead. The silver tray held by the waiter remained perfectly level. A mocking pedestal for the small plastic card that had just failed for the 4th time. A sharp, rhythmic chirp echoed through the plush dining room of the Chicago Prime Steakhouse, a sound that felt like a needle pricking at Arthur Vance's eardrums. He pressed his thumb against the embossed numbers of his corporate visa, his skin slick with a sudden, cold sweat. Across the table, Marcus Sterling didn't move. He sat in the amber glow of the chandelier, toyed with a heavy steak knife, and watched Arthur with the patient, unblinking eyes of a hawk. 1, 2, 3, 4. Arthur whispered under his breath, his ritual for stability. He needed to measure the room, to ensure the floor wouldn't vanish. He slid a personal MasterCard through the reader. The machine spat out a red light. Denied. Again. The air in the steakhouse, usually smelling of expensive charred fat and aged oak, suddenly felt thick, smelling of scorched dust and old grease. "Is there a problem, Arthur?" Marcus asked. His voice was a rolling tide, hypnotic and smooth. He didn't look at the card reader. He looked at Arthur's throat. "You seem out of sync. Maybe you've been working too hard on the logistics for the new European expansion." Arthur forced a dry smile. "Just a glitch in the magnetic strip, Marcus. I'll call the bank in the morning." But as he stepped out onto the Chicago sidewalk, the humid air hitting him like a wet blanket, he knew it wasn't a glitch. The streetlights were timed perfectly, a grid of emerald and ruby stretching toward the lake. Yet everything felt fundamentally broken. He marched toward the glass towers of Vance Logistics, his heels clicking a frantic tempo against the pavement. 1, 2, 3, 4. He reached the turnstile and pressed his badge to the sensor. A red light pulsed, as cold and final as a heartbeat stopping. He swiped again, the plastic scraping harshly against the reader. "Arthur, is there a problem?" The voice belonged to Marcus, the security guard. Arthur had known him for years, had gifted him scotch every Christmas. But now, the guard stepped from behind the mahogany desk with a rigid, military posture. His hand rested heavy on his belt, near his radio. He held up a printed memo, the ink still smelling fresh and chemical. "I can't do that, Mr. Vance," the guard said, his jaw tightening. "The system flagged your credentials 10 minutes ago. You've been declared legally deceased, Arthur. You don't exist in the system anymore. Now please step away from the glass." The words hit Arthur like a physical blow to the solar plexus. He looked through the glass at the lobby he had designed. The white marble, the brushed steel, the sterile cathedral of his own making. He was a ghost staring at his own tomb. Arthur didn't panic. He recalculated. He retreated into the shadows of a nearby alley, the smell of damp brick and dumpster rot filling his lungs. He watched the service entrance, counting the seconds between the arrival of delivery trucks. A courier in a bright orange vest approached the side door, balancing a stack of crates. Arthur moved with the precision of a shadow, stepping into the man's blind spot. As the courier pressed his sensor to the door, Arthur reached out, his hand steady, and caught the heavy steel door just before the latch clicked shut. The interior of the building hummed with a high-frequency whine that made the back of Arthur's eyes ache. He avoided the main elevators, opting for the service stairs. 1, 2, 3, 4. He climbed, his breath hitching in the stairwell that smelled of industrial cleaner and stale air. He reached the 4th floor, the heart of the machine. The server room. Inside, the air was a freezing 55 degrees, turning his breath into a fine mist. Thousands of tiny, unblinking green and blue lights watched him from the racks. He sat at a terminal, his fingers flying across the keys. He didn't need a password for the backdoor access he'd built years ago. He diverted the flow of data, bypassing the primary security gates, and began to dig. There it was, a digital file, cold and clinical. A forged death certificate from the Cook County Coroner's Office, citing a sudden cardiac event. Beneath it lay the prize, a $15 million life insurance claim, filed only 3 hours ago by Marcus Sterling. The beneficiary wasn't Arthur's estate. It was the company's emergency liquidity fund, a black hole Marcus controlled. "Arthur?" A soft, trembling voice came from the shadows behind a rack of humming processors. Arthur spun, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was Sarah Johnson, a junior analyst who usually spent her days apologizing to the office coffee machine. She stood there, her oversized glasses reflecting the blinking LEDs, an ink stain dark on her index finger. "I saw the flag on the network," she whispered, her voice rising at the end like a question. "They said you were gone? But the keystroke rhythm on this terminal, it's yours. No one else types with that specific cadence." "Marcus is trying to erase me, Sarah," Arthur said, his voice low and jagged. "I need the wire transfer records. I need to see where that insurance money is headed." Sarah hesitated, her shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. Then she stepped forward. Her fingers moved across the keyboard, not with Arthur's mechanical force, but with a quiet, desperate speed. "I found a hidden path," she said. "A series of offshore accounts in the Caymans. It's not just the insurance, Arthur. There's a massive hole in the pension fund. Millions are being siphoned out." Suddenly, the heavy pressurized door to the server room hissed open. The sound was like a serpent's strike. Robert Miller, the head of security, stepped into the blue light. He was a massive man, his suit straining against bull-like shoulders. He didn't speak. He simply reached for the silk tie at his throat, straightening it 3 times with a slow, deliberate rasp of fabric. "Mr. Vance," Miller said, his voice a low grunt. "You're trespassing on private property." He lunged. Arthur didn't have the strength to match Miller, but he had the floor plan. As Miller swung a collapsible baton, a heavy piece of metal that whistled through the freezing air, Arthur ducked. The baton struck a server casing with a shower of sparks. Arthur grabbed a heavy leather-bound ledger from a nearby desk and shoved it into Miller's midsection, using the momentum to push the big man back. Miller roared, a sound that vibrated in the floorboards. He swung again, but Arthur was already moving. He shoved a heavy, rolling server rack with all his weight. The metal wheels shrieked against the floor, and the rack toppled, pinning Miller's leg against the concrete. The security chief let out a choked cry, his face turning a bruised purple in the strobe of the alarm lights. "Go!" Arthur shouted to Sarah. He grabbed a black flash drive from the terminal, the cold metal biting into his palm. They scrambled toward the exit, the smell of ozone and scorched electronics trailing behind them. subverted. They reached the shadowed alcove of the parking garage, the air smelling of exhaust and cold concrete. Arthur clutched the flash drive like a holy relic. He had it. The proof of the forgery, the offshore accounts, the betrayal. He looked at Sarah, his chest heaving. "This is it," Arthur said, his voice filled with a rare spark of hope. "We take this to the board of directors. William Taylor has been with this company since my father started it. He's a man of the old guard. He values the legacy. Once he sees that Marcus faked my death to cover an insurance scam, he'll have the SEC here in an hour. We're going to be okay, Sarah." Arthur felt a wave of relief wash over him. The logic was sound. The board stood to lose everything if Marcus's fraud was exposed. They would protect the company, and by extension, they would protect Arthur. He could almost feel the weight of his life returning to him, the deceased tag being torn away by the hands of justice. Sarah looked at him, her eyes hidden in the shadows. She took a deep breath, her shoulders dropping. "You're right, Arthur. William is in his office right now. He's staying late for the memorial planning. If we go now, we can catch him before Marcus realizes we've left the server room." They moved through the darkened corridors, the silence of the building feeling like a supportive embrace rather than a threat. They reached the executive suite, the mahogany doors standing tall and dignified. Arthur knocked. "Come in," a gravelly, weary voice called out. William Taylor sat behind his desk, a glass of scotch in his hand. He looked up, his silver hair shimmering in the lamplight. He gave a long, rattling sigh, the sound of a man carrying the world. "Arthur," he breathed, a small, sad smile touching his lips. "I heard the news. I couldn't believe it. To see you standing here, it's a miracle." Arthur stepped forward, placing the flash drive on the desk. "It wasn't a miracle, William. It was a crime. Marcus tried to kill me on paper. Look at the files, the insurance claim, the offshore wires. He's been gutting us." William picked up the drive, turning it over in his liver-spotted hands. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Sarah. Sarah didn't look back. She stared at the floor, her hands trembling. "I know, Arthur," William said softly. Arthur paused. A small, cold prickle danced across the back of his neck. "What do you mean, you know?" "The expansion into Europe," William said, his voice devoid of its earlier warmth. "The logistics costs tripled last quarter. We were facing a total collapse of the stock price. The bank was going to call in the loans. We needed a massive influx of liquid capital, and we needed it yesterday." Arthur's world began to tilt. "So you knew about the insurance claim?" "We authorized it, Arthur," William said, the rattling sigh returning. "The entire board. We needed $15 million to bridge the gap. Marcus didn't act alone. He acted for the greater good of the company. You were the only variable we could spare. You have no living family, no heirs. A tragic death was the cleanest way to save 8,000 jobs." The truth hit Arthur like a physical weight, crushing the air from his lungs. He looked at Sarah. She finally looked up, her eyes swimming with tears. "I'm sorry, Arthur," she whispered. "They told me if I helped find the leaks in the server room, I'd keep my job. I didn't have a choice." The door behind them clicked shut. Robert Miller stood there, his leg bandaged, his eyes burning with a dull, vengeful light. He wasn't there to arrest Arthur. He was there to finish the logistics of a dead man. Arthur wasn't just a fugitive from Marcus. He was a fugitive from the very institution he had spent his life building. He had handed his only evidence to the people who had ordered his erasure. He was more than dead now. He was a liability that needed to be liquidated. The building groaned. Marcus Sterling had initiated a full-scale maintenance lockdown. High-pitched sirens, like the scream of a dying animal, began to wail through the ventilation ducts. The emergency lights flickered to life, casting long, jagged shadows across the halls. Arthur scrambled back as Miller stepped forward, but Sarah, in a sudden flash of guilt-driven courage, shoved a heavy mail cart into Miller's path. "Run, Arthur," she screamed. Arthur didn't wait. He bolted into the darkened stairwell, the smell of gray, industrial primer and cold concrete filling his senses. He headed down, but his mind was racing. The board was in on it. The insurance company must be too. He was trapped in a box made of glass and mahogany. He reached the 10th floor and ducked into his own office. It was a space he had occupied for 15 years, but as he stepped inside, he stopped. The room smelled of bleach, harsh, stinging, and clinical. His mahogany desk was empty. The photos of his parents, the architectural models, the pens he liked to keep parallel to the desk edge, all gone. Even the dust had been wiped away. The wall clock was frozen at 6:14 p.m., the exact minute the bank had flagged him as deceased. It was as if he had never existed. He heard footsteps in the hall. Not the heavy thud of Miller, but a lighter, more rhythmic sound. Humming, a low, discordant funeral dirge. It was Mike Davis, Miller's second-in-command. Arthur could see him through the glass partition, a wiry man with a nervous twitch in his eye, carrying a heavy stun gun that crackled with blue energy. Arthur ducked into the break room. The space felt lonely, the plastic chairs radiating the sadness of a place where people existed but never connected. A happy birthday banner hung from the ceiling, but the name had been neatly cut out with a razor blade. He reached into the trash can, his fingers brushing against something hard and cold. A burner phone. He flipped it open. One message. Sub-level 4. The truth is in the dirt. The humming grew louder. Davis was in the break room now. Arthur grabbed a pressurized fire extinguisher from the wall. The metal was cold, biting into his palms. As Davis rounded the corner, his eyes wide and hunting, Arthur pulled the pin. A cloud of white, freezing chemical powder erupted. Davis screamed as the powder hit his eyes, blinding him. Arthur didn't stay to watch. He leaped onto a table, ripped a ceiling tile away, and hauled himself into the crawl space. The air up there was hot and tasted of old insulation and rat droppings, but it was his only path. He crawled through the dark, his fingers scraping against the metal vents. He reached a junction and looked down through a grate. Below him was the main security hub. He saw Marcus Sterling standing there, leaning over a console. "I don't care about the mess," Marcus was saying into a phone. "Just ensure the body is found in the lake by morning. Use the Miller brothers' contact at the morgue." Arthur felt a cold fury settle in his gut. He reached into his pocket and realized he still had the flash drive. No, wait. He had two. In the chaos of the server room, he had grabbed a second drive from Marcus's private terminal. He plugged it into a small, handheld diagnostic tool he carried. His breath hitched. It wasn't insurance files. It was a set of rolling encryption keys, Marcus's personal credentials for the Federal Reserve's high-frequency trading platform. This was the source of the European expansion funds. It wasn't just embezzlement. It was a massive, illegal manipulation of the market. Arthur realized then that he didn't need to prove he was alive. He needed to make Marcus wish he were dead. He began to navigate the ventilation shafts toward the HVAC room, his plan forming with the cold, mathematical precision of a man who counted his steps. The air in the sublevels was a thick, damp heat. Marcus had turned off the building's oxygen filtration, and every breath felt like pulling wet wool into his lungs. Arthur reached the HVAC room, the roar of massive fans vibrating in his teeth. A massive piston slammed every 4 seconds, a mechanical heartbeat that shook his ribs. He found a secondary terminal tucked behind a cooling unit. His fingers moved across the keys, fueled by a desperate adrenaline. He used Marcus's codes to access the offshore accounts. He didn't just watch the money. He executed a kill switch protocol he designed for the company's own assets in case of a hostile takeover. One by one, the accounts froze. The flow of stolen millions stopped. "You always were too fond of the details, Arthur." The voice was sharp, cutting through the roar of the fans. Arthur turned. Marcus Sterling stood in the doorway, a silenced pistol in his hand. The charcoal suit was perfect, his silk tie unruffled. He looked like a man who had just finished a pleasant lunch, not a man hunting his partner. Crack, crack. Marcus cracked his knuckle twice. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the cramped room. "You think freezing a few accounts changes anything?" Marcus asked, leaning into Arthur's personal space. "The world believes you're a ghost, and ghosts don't have standing in court." He fired. The bullet hissed past Arthur's ear, sparking off a steam pipe. Arthur dove behind a massive ventilation duct, the smell of hot oil and ozone filling the air. He scrambled through the maze of machinery, luring Marcus higher, away from the exits, toward the glass-walled penthouse. They reached the top floor, a space of terrifying beauty. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline, a sea of flickering lights. But there was nowhere to hide. The massive glass dining table sat in the center, appearing to float over the street 60 stories below. "It's over, Arthur," Marcus said, his voice a hypnotic tide. "The disposal team is in the lobby. The police are on their way to investigate a break-in by a disgruntled former employee. You're the villain in this story. Think on that. Subverted." Arthur stood by the glass wall, his back to the void. He held up a small tablet, the screen glowing. "I've already moved the money, Marcus. I didn't just freeze the accounts. I rerouted the $15 million from the insurance claim. I sent it to a series of encrypted wallets. You want the money? You'll have to let me walk out of here." Arthur felt a surge of triumph. He had the leverage. Marcus was a predator, but he was a predator driven by greed. He wouldn't kill the only man who had the keys to $15 million. This was the smart move, the logical move. He had turned his erasure into an asset. Marcus stopped. He lowered the pistol slightly, a look of genuine surprise crossing his face. You moved the funds? Into your own private wallets?" "Every cent," Arthur said, his voice steady. "The board gets nothing. You get nothing. Unless I'm safely out of this building and across the state line." Marcus began to laugh. It wasn't a cold laugh. It was a warm, appreciative sound that made the hair on Arthur's arms stand up. "Oh, Arthur, you really are a master of logistics. You've accounted for every decimal point, haven't you?" "I have," Arthur said, his confidence growing. "Now put the gun down." Marcus nodded, his posture relaxing. He tucked the pistol into his waistband and stepped toward the glass table. "You're right. Money is the only thing that matters. I can't kill you if the money dies with you. That would be inefficient." Arthur let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He had won. He had outmaneuvered the man who had stolen his life. He began to step toward the door. "Just one thing, Arthur," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Did you check the destination of those wallets? The ones you encrypted using my credentials? Arthur paused, a cold knot forming in his stomach. What are you talking about? Marcus tapped a few commands into his own phone. The credentials I let you find on that drive? They weren't for the Federal Reserve. They were for a mirrored system I set up months ago. A trap for anyone trying to trace the embezzlement. When you moved that money, you didn't send it to an anonymous wallet. You sent it directly into your own personal primary checking account at Chase, the one linked to your Social Security number. Arthur's heart stopped. He looked at his tablet. The transaction logs were changing. The encrypted addresses were dissolving, revealing his own name, his own account number. The police aren't coming for a break-in, Arthur, Marcus said, his eyes gleaming with a predatory light. They're coming for a thief. To the feds, it looks like you faked your own death to trigger a $15 million insurance payout. And then you personally logged in to transfer that money into your own pocket. You didn't just steal the money. You provided the digital confession. You're not a ghost anymore. You're the most documented criminal in Chicago. The world tilted. Arthur looked down through the glass floor at the street below. He saw the blue and red lights of the police cruisers, dozens of them, surrounding the building. He had tried to be smart, and in doing so, he had built his own prison. He wasn't just legally dead. He was legally a monster. The sirens below grew into a deafening wail, a rising shriek that vibrated in the marrow of Arthur's teeth. Marcus pulled a silver lighter from his pocket and flicked it. The flame danced, reflecting in the glass walls. He tossed a stack of papers onto the floor, forged suicide notes, written in a perfect imitation of Arthur's hand, detailing his guilt over the embezzlement. The fire will take care of the rest, Marcus said. A tragic end for a man who couldn't live with his crimes. He dropped the lighter. The papers caught instantly, the smell of burning ink and expensive bond paper filling the room. Arthur looked at the flames, then at the server rack in the corner that controlled the building's automated systems. He didn't panic. He recalculated. He lunged for the terminal. 1, 2, 3, 4, he shouted, his voice cracking. He didn't try to stop the fire. Instead, he accessed the market crash protocol he had seen earlier. If the building's internal temperature rose too high, the system was designed to automatically unlock every door and purge the servers to prevent total data loss. He bypassed the heat sensors, tricking the system into thinking the entire floor was an inferno. A massive clunk echoed through the building. The emergency doors hissed open. The elevators began to descend. Arthur grabbed Marcus by the collar, the silk of the expensive suit bunching in his fist. We're going down together, Marcus, Arthur hissed. The penthouse was filling with smoke, a thick gray cloud that tasted of chemicals. Arthur dragged a struggling, shouting Marcus into the elevator. They plummeted toward the lobby, the sensation of falling making Arthur's stomach churn. The doors opened to a sea of black tactical gear and blinding flashlights. "Drop the weapon!" a voice boomed. Arthur shoved Marcus onto the marble floor. He stood there, his hands raised, the heat of the fire still clinging to his clothes. A cop with a coffee-stained tie and a weary look in his eyes stepped forward. David Wilson. He looked at Arthur, then at Marcus, who was already screaming about corporate sabotage. "I have the logs," Arthur said, his voice surprisingly calm. "Search the sub-level 4 terminal. You'll find the Miller brothers' signatures on the manual override. And check the typing cadence on the insurance claim. It doesn't match mine. It matches Marcus Sterling's secretarial pool." Wilson looked at a crumpled piece of paper in his own hand. A grocery list, his tether to the world. He looked back at Arthur. "You, Vance?" "I was," Arthur said. Now, I'm just a man who knows where the bodies are buried. The rain outside was cold, hitting Arthur's face and numbing his skin. He sat on the back of an ambulance, a shock blanket draped over his shoulders. He watched as Marcus Sterling and the Miller brothers were led away in handcuffs, their expensive suits looking crumpled and pathetic in the harsh light of the police cruisers. Rebecca Thompson, the lawyer who had once tried to expose the company, stood nearby. She smelled of harsh antiseptic and didn't offer a hand, but she gave him a sharp, professional nod. "The legal battle to resurrect you will take years, Arthur," she said. "Technically, you still don't exist. You have no bank accounts, no home, no title." Arthur looked at his hands. They were dirty, scraped, and shaking. But for the first time in his life, he didn't feel the need to count. The ground beneath him felt solid, not because of a ledger or a structural report, but because he was breathing. "I've spent my whole life being a name on a building," Arthur said. "Maybe being a ghost isn't so bad." He stood up, leaving the blanket behind. He walked away from the sirens, away from the glass towers, toward the gray horizon of Lake Michigan. The sun was beginning to rise, a thin line of gold breaking the dark water. He pulled his collar up against the wind and kept walking. A man without a ledger, finally, truly alive.